In the small town of Chama, New Mexico, it's quiet on the main street in the early morning. However, out in the yard of the Cumbres and Toltec Scenic Railroad, activities have already started for the day. Hostlers are busy moving Mikado steam locomotive number 489 to the ash pit, where its fire will be cleaned. The engine sat quietly near the shop area during the night. A hostler kept an eye on the locomotive, adding fuel and water when necessary as it simmered away the night. The day crew is now busy preparing the engine for its run to Antonito, Colorado. In a scene that has been repeated thousands of times since the arrival of the narrow gauge in Chama, the engine has its fire cleaned. The crew shakes the fire grates, forcing the excess ash and cinders out of the bottom of the firebox. This is a daily procedure necessary for coal-burning steam locomotives. The buildup of ash and cinders in the firebox will impede the efficient firing of the engine. The engine is sitting close to the coaling tower, which dates from the turn of the century. This classic tower is still intact, but has been inoperable for a number of years. After shaking the grates, the excess ash is blown out of the grate area with compressed air from the engine. The accumulated ashes and cinders will be allowed to cool before being gathered and used as ballast along the railroad right-of-way. Once the crew has finished cleaning the fire, they back the engine away from the tower and through the yard. The locomotive will end up on the coaling spur to the west of the tower. There, the tender will be topped off with coal. This is accomplished with a modern tractor-driven front-end loader. Near the shop area, other locomotives are evident. Mikado number 484 simmers quietly on one of the shop tracks. Center cab diesel locomotive number 19 sits on an adjoining track. This engine is used to move the steam engines around the shop area during the winter months when they are not under steam. It is also used out on the line in maintenance work before the regular tourist season starts. To the west of the modern two-stall building sits steam engine number 487. Which is also a K36 Mikado type engine. It is also steamed up awaiting its next assignment. Once number 489 has been replenished with coal and filled with water, it is back down into the yard where it will sit until it is time to be coupled to its train. The depot and yard area of the Cumbres and Toltec Scenic Railroad remains much the same as it was at the turn of the century. As passengers arrive for the day's trip, they are free to explore and examine the many artifacts and equipment in the yard and depot area. The tracks are full of vintage equipment that was used by the Denver and Rio Grande Railway when it owned the line. Much of the equipment dates back to the turn of the century and remains unchanged in appearance. Freight, passenger cars, cranes, and other equipment in various states of repair fill the yard tracks. The great variety of equipment contributes to the authenticity and old-time atmosphere of the railroad in Chama. As the departure time for today's train draws closer, number 489 backs down to couple to its train. While passengers board the cars, the crew in the cab of the locomotive is busy preparing for the day's work. The engineer enjoys some liquid refreshment as the fireman shovels coal into the firebox. A fire must be properly prepared before an engine can start the steep climb to the top of Cumbres Pass. These engines were never equipped with mechanical stokers and have always been fired by hand. This means hard work for the fireman, who has to feed coal into the firebox during the hour-and-a-half climb to the summit of Cumbres Pass. Once the passengers are on board, the train is ready to depart. The engineer slowly pulls back on the throttle to get the train moving. The grade for the first several miles out of Chama is fairly moderate. Trains move along at a fast clip as they roll through the area called the Narrows. The engine encounters the first of the 4% grade as it approaches Lobato Meadows. From here to the summit, it will be an all-out battle, with the locomotive really having to work to reach the top at Cumbres Pass. The train slows as it rolls onto the Lobato trestle. Below is Wolf Creek. Frequent obstacles encountered by the steam trains are the livestock that choose to snack on grasses growing on or near the railroad track. This group of horses is a classic case in point. Only after much blowing of the whistle and the noisy hissing of escaping steam from the open cylinder cocks are the horses frightened away. During the long climb to the summit of Cumbres Pass, the fireman shovels 1.5 tons of coal into the firebox. The engineer and fireman swap responsibilities halfway up the mountain, sharing the tough job of shoveling the coal into the boiler. With one hand on the throttle, the engineer diligently coaxes the maximum amount of power out of the engine without slipping the drivers. The Cumbres and Toltec Scenic is one of just 2 remaining examples of the once flourishing Rio Grande narrow gauge system. Built in the late 1800s, the narrow gauge was constructed to help tap the vast mineral resources in the Colorado Rocky Mountains. At one time, over 2,000 miles of narrow gauge rails were in use in Colorado and New Mexico. During the early 1900s, the minerals began to play out, diminishing the role of the narrow gauge. Only 552 miles of narrow gauge remained in existence after the Second World War. That decreased to 264 miles by the middle 1950s. Those miles were confined to the remaining 3-foot gauge main lines of the Rio Grande, running from Alamosa to Durango, Colorado, and on the railroad's 2 branches, one branch running from Durango to Silverton, and the other running south from Durango to Farmington, New Mexico. By all indications, the Rio Grande narrow gauge should have died in the 1950s. The line got a new lease on life, however, when natural gas was discovered near Farmington. To harvest the gas, miles and miles of pipe were required, pipe that needed to be shipped in by rail because of the poor roads available at the time. The revival of the narrow gauge lasted for almost a decade. Train after train of pipe traveled over Cumbres Pass on its way to the gas fields near Farmington. When the last pipe was laid, the narrow gauge fell again into decline. Only 4 trains traveled the railroad during the entire year of 1968. The last revenue freight train ran during November of that year. The main line from Durango to Chama was torn up in the early 1970s. Fortunately, a scenic portion of the line from Antonito, Colorado to Chama, New Mexico was purchased by the states of Colorado and New Mexico. As soon as an operator for the line could be found, regularly scheduled passenger trains were again running over Cumbres Pass during the summer months. Several years after its opening, Kyle Railways was appointed to operate the Cumbres and Toltec Scenic Railroad. Negotiating the last curve around Windy Point, the train has almost conquered the tough grade to the summit. As the highest spot on the railroad, Cumbres Pass is at the 10,015-foot elevation. The engine and train are stopped at the old depot next to the water plug. Here, the firemen will fill the tender with water before the train continues its journey to Osier. Once the tender has been filled with water, the train departs. It will head downhill toward its lunch stop at Osier. The weather in the mountains of New Mexico and Colorado can be beautiful. On warm, sunny days, passengers aboard the train will often migrate to the open-air observation cars. Here they can enjoy the incredible scenery and the sunshine with an unhindered view. At Los Pinos, the train comes around a horseshoe curve in a narrow valley. It is in this type of railroad construction that the advantages of the narrow gauge can be seen. Narrow gauge rolling stock and engines were shorter and lighter. Thus curves could be shorter or tighter, and lighter rail could also be used. The net effect was that a narrow gauge railroad could be built more quickly and more cheaply than a standard gauge line. The Rio Grande Railroad had planned to standard gauge the entire line from Alamosa to Durango in the early 1900s, but never did. That was probably due to the high expense involved. Osier is the halfway point on the railroad. This small railroad settlement is perched on the side of Osier Mountain at the 9,637-foot elevation. This isolated railroad town has a water tank, old depot, and other railroad buildings. There is also a passing siding here. The two scheduled passenger trains, one from Chama and the other from Antonito, meet here daily and swap engines. The trains return to their point of origin, but the engines and crews run through. The train from Antonito usually arrives first. Once it is stopped at the lunchroom and gift shop, the engine uncouples from the train. It pulls forward in the siding, stopping clear of the switch at the other end. While waiting for the other train to arrive from Chama, the crew brings out their lunchboxes for an impromptu picnic on the grass. Passengers detrain here and can enjoy a hot meal, browse in the gift shop, or wander around this old historic railroad town. A new and larger lunchroom was constructed here several years ago to handle the ever-increasing number of passengers who ride the trains. Staggering the arrival of the trains allows the lunchroom to handle the influx of patrons in a more orderly manner. 15 minutes later, a whistle announces the approach of the train from Chama. Its arrival at Osier will spark another round of activity. Upon its arrival, the train from Chama will enter the siding and roll to a stop. The engines will then swap trains for the remainder of the trip. Passengers have a variety of tour options available to them when riding the Cumbres and Toltec Scenic Railroad. They can ride to Osier from either end of the railroad and then return, or they can ride the full length of the railroad by changing trains at Osier and continuing to the other end of the line. These passengers are then bused back to their points of origin, or they can stay overnight in a motel, returning to their starting point the next day by train. Once the hour-long lunch stop has been completed, passengers reboard their trains for the completion of their journeys. Engine 489 leaves Osier first, with the return train to Antonito, Colorado. Shortly after leaving Osier, the train rolls through the spectacular Toltec Gorge. The view is breathtaking from the open-air cars.
Maybe
Exiting Rock Tunnel, the train continues its descent as the tracks skirt the Toltec Valley. Aspen trees are in great abundance along this part of the railroad. These provide beautiful splashes of color when their leaves change hue in early fall. Approaching Antonito, the lush vegetation of the higher elevations gives way to the sparse scrub brush of the high desert. It's here that the longest stretch of straight track on the railroad can be found. Trains reach their highest speeds rolling over this 5-mile section of rail. One train spends the night in Antonito, Colorado, the end of the line. Locomotives are housed in the small shop located near the depot. A loop track used to turn the train circles the depot and the shop area. The depot, locomotive shop, loop track, and the water tank were built new by the railroad. Antonito is now the eastern end of the narrow gauge. When the line was owned and operated by the Rio Grande, it extended to Alamosa on the north and south to Santa Fe, New Mexico. The line to Santa Fe was referred to as the Chile Line. From Antonito to Alamosa, Colorado, the line was dual-gauged. Both standard and narrow-gauge trains called at Antonito. Many of the industries in town were supplied with standard-gauge cars, but were sometimes switched with narrow-gauge engines. This was accomplished by using a special idler car equipped with both standard and narrow-gauge couplers. The only example of dual-gauge trackage left is a small display section near the depot. Approaching Bighorn Y, the train is climbing the 1.5% grade on the eastern approach to Cumbres Pass. Locomotives have a much easier time pulling trains up this side of the mountain due to its moderate grade. In this area, the scrub brush of the lower desert elevation has begun to disappear, replaced by the large trees and the green grasses prevalent at the higher elevations. Passengers aboard today's train are in for a surprise. An encampment of soldiers reenacting military life, as it might have been back in the late 1800s, have set up their tents here. They are standing at attention, ready to salute the train as it rolls by their outpost. There are many horseshoe curves on this serpentine railroad. The train is about to negotiate one of these near milepost 302 between Bighorn and Sublette. The straight line distance from Chama to Antonito is only about 35 miles. It takes the railroad 64 miles of twisting and turning through the mountains to get from Chama to Antonito. The abandoned town of Sublette is approximately halfway between Antonito and Osier. This was once a busy railroad town that housed section crews who worked on the track year-round. Many of the buildings are still standing as a reminder of busier times on the railroad. Here, the engine will take water from the water plug before continuing its westbound journey. Water supplied to the plug comes from a natural underground spring in the town of Sublette. While the engine's tender is being filled, one of the crew members fills the big igloo jug with the refreshing spring water. This will be enjoyed by the engine crew in the hot cab of the locomotive. At Osier, it is again lunchtime as both trains are parked outside of the lunchroom. Signs hung on the trains clearly indicate which train to board when leaving Osier. Participants from the military encampment at Bighorn are on hand parading up and down the trains. Their presence contributes to the old-time atmosphere of the railroad. With lunch completed, 2 long blasts on the whistle announce the departure of the trains. Shortly after leaving Osier, the westbound train crosses Cascade Trestle. This is the highest and longest bridge on the line. It is 409 feet long and towers 137 feet over Cascade Creek. The bridge was originally built of wood, but was replaced with a modern steel deck girder bridge in the 1920s. The steel structure was built to standard gauge specifications in case the railroad was ever rebuilt to standard gauge. Approaching the water tank at Los Pinos, the train is about to negotiate the horseshoe curve at the end of the Los Pinos Valley. The westbound train whistles for the road crossing as it approaches the summit at Cumbres Pass. It will stop at the water plug to replenish its thirst before starting the descent down the mountain to Chama. Departing Cumbres Pass, the train immediately rolls by Windy Point, one of the famous locations on the railroad. The sharp curve around the point necessitates a slow speed as the train slips around the narrow ledge of crumbling rock. An operable water tank still stands at Cresco. This tank is used occasionally by trains climbing the steep grade to Cumbres. West of the water tank is Cresco siding, where trains can pass each other. Nearing Lobato, the train crosses the second largest bridge on the line, Lobato Trestle. This bridge is also made of steel and is 310 feet long and towers 100 feet over Wolf Creek. Like Cascade Trestle, this bridge was built to standard gauge specifications. train passes a fake water tank and depot near the tracks at Lobato. These were built by a movie company. Over the years, a large number of films have been photographed on the railroad. Most of these have been period westerns requiring an old-time look. The cattle and sheep pens near the track are original and were once used to ship livestock to markets or to lower elevations for winter grazing. Nearing Chama, the train crosses the Chama River on a steel truss bridge built in the 1920s. The train passes steam-powered rotary OY as it enters the yard at Chama. This historic rotary is still operable. It is used to clear the railroad of snowdrifts after a particularly heavy snowfall in the late spring. You can see this rotary in action in Pentrex's production entitled Smoke, Steam, and Snow. Another successful and exhilarating trip on the Cumbres and Toltec Scenic Railroad is about to end. Happy faces abound as the train pulls into the depot area and stops. This is truly a family adventure for all ages, as evidenced by the great variety of people exiting the train. At the west end of the yard, engine 487 rolls by the stock pens which border one leg of the Y. Backing out of the other leg of the Y, the engine stops at what is now the western end of the railroad. Before the Denver and Rio Grande Railway closed the narrow gauge line in 1968, it continued west to Durango. This portion of the line west from Chama was removed in the early 1970s. Back in the yard, the engine pulls into the coaling spur where its tender will be filled with coal. This daily ritual is performed before the engine is taken to the shop building for the night. Engine 487 has changed little since its manufacture in 1925 by the Baldwin Locomotive Works. 10 of these 282 Mikados were built as part of the K-36 class of locomotives for the Rio Grande. They were the last narrow-gauge steam power bought new by the railroad. The K-36 class locomotives are outside frame engines. The drive wheels are on the inside of the engine frame, while the main rods, side rods, and counterweights are on the outside of the frame. Outside frame engines are heavier and more powerful than their more typical inside frame counterparts. The K-36 class engines weigh 286,000 pounds with their tenders loaded and produce over 36,000 pounds of tractive effort. The tenders carry 9.5 tons of coal and 5,000 gallons of water. The K-36 class engines were the real workhorses of the Rio Grande narrow gauge. One unusual item of interest in the Chama yard is the water tank. It has 2 water spouts supplied by a single tank. Most water tanks have a single water spout. After the engine has been fueled, it backs out of the spur and heads for the shop building. There it will be serviced and cleaned for its next assignment. If one steam engine at the head of a train is exciting to watch, then 2 are double the fun. The Cumbres and Toltec Scenic will run 2 locomotives on a train when the number of cars that can be pulled by one engine is exceeded. This is a fairly common occurrence on major holidays. It is also increasingly more common due to the growing passenger loads the railroad has been hauling in recent years. One problem with the operation of 2 steam locomotives at the head of a train occurs at the Lobato trestle. This trestle cannot support the weight of 2 steam locomotives simultaneously. Before crossing Lobato trestle, it is necessary to separate the 2 engines. The first engine runs across the trestle by itself. The second engine, still coupled to the train, pulls it across the bridge. It then recouples to the first engine waiting on the other side. The train will then continue its journey with the 2 engines. Once the train has reached the summit of Cumbres Pass, the lead or helper engine cuts off the train and pulls into the siding. Once it is out of the way, the mainline train departs pulled by the road engine. The helper locomotive then turns on the Y so that it will be headed in the right direction for the return to Chama. At one time, this entire Y area was covered by a snowshed. The only remaining remnant of this vast snowshed complex is a small crumbling section over the north end of the Y. After turning on the Y, the engine stops at the water spout to take on water. While watering, the engineer will check the side rod bearings for any excess heat. Once the servicing is complete, the engine will depart Cumbres Pass for the return to Chama. Riding the Cumbres and Toltec Scenic Railroad is a thoroughly captivating experience. It presents one of the few opportunities to get a taste of railroading and life as it might have been in the late 1800s. It's easy to understand why the highest and longest narrow-gauge railroad in North America is becoming more popular each year.